Now, our first performer this evening has been trying to find his way for so many years. We're actually concerned that he would find his way up to the platform tonight. And after that, we have no idea what's going to happen because he's actually the kind of guy that will step up to a microphone, hitch up his pants, lean in with great intent, and then start out with something absolutely ordinary, like, well now, summer jobs came and went, and sometimes didn't show up at all. But college was coming. My generation was more or less the first one in my family to take a crack at that. Everyone needed to step up, and frankly, my dream of writing poetry wasn't bringing anything in. And then, hunched over the newspaper one morning, I saw it. It whispered like an oracle. Sell encyclopedias. Salary plus commission. Now, I know what you're thinking, but my mom and dad bought our encyclopedias from some random guy who had showed up at the front door, so it could be done. And it turned out that Sell Encyclopedia's salary plus commission was located in a small 2-bedroom home right on the edge of an industrial area in Oklahoma City. And maybe a half a dozen of us would-be salesmen and women were standing around in that converted living room among a scattering of folding chairs, blackboard at one end. And as part of orientation, they asked us what jobs we'd had before. Now, at 16, I was a grill cook behind the counter of a small strip mall diner, and we were proud that we made our hash browns from scratch. So probably not relevant to encyclopedia sales. One summer, I ran the Tilt-A-Whirl at Spring Lake Amusement Park, and I brought thrills to thousands of people. But there definitely would not be any thrills in encyclopedia sales. Now, one time, I took the civil service exam in hopes of landing a summer job out at Tinker Air Force Base, which is where my dad worked. I knew how to take exams. And I was proud to have landed a job tabulating work hours in a B-52 planning unit, which is exactly the same area where my dad worked radio and radar, so maybe this would impress my new bosses. But hanging off one side of that blackboard, the supervisor sneered, "Civil service exams are a joke. Your dad probably got you that job." Now, my dad worked on B-52s. He'd also worked on Eisenhower's planes once, and I really needed this encyclopedia job, but I didn't know how much pride I could work up into work that disrespected the civil service exam. Right? But all that morning, first, they began to explain to us just how important encyclopedias could be to the education of young children or the whole family. They told us about the sales kit contained in this box here, containing full-color laminated illustrations of exactly that very point. And they outlined for us the sales pitch and the strategy designed to make every prospective customer answer yes with almost religious fervor. You got to get them to say yes, they wanted what was best for their children, and yes, they agreed that encyclopedias could be useful, and yes, the terms were reasonable and almost too good to be true, and yes, I'm going to sign there, and I think I'll put my initials there. Now, that sales kit was for showing, not sharing, with a customer. And they wrote in great detail all about the strategy and the sales pitch up on the blackboard, but we were supposed to write it down in our own handwriting because that would help us remember it better. And besides, they just didn't have that written material with the company's name on it yet. And then, after all of that training for an entire morning, they handed us each a mentor to guide us in our first foray out into the field, and I got my supervisor. Mr. Civil Service exams are a joke. He had told me during training that I just wasn't being aggressive enough with my yes questions. You got to get them to commit for their children's sake. For their children's sake, because frankly, adults don't give a shit about knowledge. And then they packed us all shoulder to shoulder in an old station wagon, drove us out, and dropped each of those sales pairs across a small suburban neighborhood in the hot and early afternoon. My supervisor and I, excuse me, walked up the first sidewalk of our very first house, already beginning to sweat under our coats and ties. Up on the porch, we could hear the radio drifting through the open screen door, and my supervisor rang that doorbell like he intended to go on, forcefully. And after a minute or two, a middle-aged guy came to the door dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, and my supervisor started in on his spiel, but the guy didn't answer yes to any of the 4 yes questions, just said he wasn't interested. And my supervisor caught my eye with a look that said he'd show me how this was done. And turning back to his mark with a practiced look that practically shouted he could not believe this family was abandoning their children, he pushed on the pressure. Now this time he got 2 yeses to the 4 yes questions, but still the guy wasn't interested. Now my supervisor, who had not read the room so far, apparently decided this was a teaching moment. And he started in just shy of accusing a prospective customer of abandoning his family, and he hadn't even gotten to the point where he pointed out that he'd already answered yes twice to the 4 yes questions, when the guy reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, showed us his deputy sheriff badge, and asked us if we had the necessary door-to-door sales license. And my supervisor clutched his briefcase to his chest. Of course, we've got a license. Could the deputy see it? Certainly. Usually. Unfortunately, he'd put the license in his briefcase. But unfortunately, left the key to the briefcase back on his desk at the office. But all that deputy sheriff did was invite us into the front room of his home so we could get out of the worst of the heat and sit and wait while he called a squad car, because after all, we had been selling encyclopedias without a license. And in that dim, brown and burnt orange living room, the ceiling fan hummed in the background, and it pushed hot and sticky air down over all of us. And while we were waiting to be picked up and taken to jail, the deputy sheriff leaned back in his recliner and admitted that they'd actually been thinking about getting encyclopedias for their 2 youngest. You know, and it's just a shame that all that sales material was locked up in that briefcase. And my leader glared at that deputy sheriff under his brow, finally read the room, and did not take the bait. But as it happened, those two youngest had been watching us this whole time, peering out around the kitchen door there. The smallest of them dressed in what had to be a replica of his dad's deputy uniform. And then his wife stepped out of the kitchen and brought us all a tall, cool glass of sweet iced tea. And she sat down on the sofa where I was just to talk for a minute, just wondering what I studied during the school year. And, it turned out that she had taken speech and drama in high school as well. And as a matter of fact, both of us in our senior year had won a prize for poetry. And I just felt so proud to be able to, just to talk so coolly about school to my arresting officer's wife. But only a short time later, in the back of the squad car, my leader told me out of the corner of his mouth not to say anything because someone from the office would pick us up at the jail when we didn't show up at the rendezvous point later that evening. Like maybe this had happened before. None of my blackboard notes covered this, right? I mean, all you needed was the proper attitude, the sales kit full of full-color laminated illustrations that would fold out to show you just exactly what the real encyclopedias would look like on your bookshelf, and of course the 3-color carbon-coated order forms. But at the intake desk, they took our briefcase and all of my notes about what to do after I'd gotten the proper answers to the 4 yes questions, and our belts, and our shoelaces, just in case we fell into despair at not having a license. But I couldn't tell where they took my supervisor, but me, they let out of a different door and they're in receiving down this long hallway lined with these open barred holding cells. And then they shooed me into the only empty one left about a halfway back, and I stood there looking at the cells across the hall. No sinks, no toilets. I mean, just a bunch of guys sitting slumped on these hardwood benches that stuck out from the wall, like my bench, which I sat on for a while, but that got kind of boring, and then I began to pace back and forth, but that just made me even more nervous, and I did not hang on the bars like you see in all those prison movies because they just didn't look like they clean the bars very often. And then, my contacts had begun to get scratchy from all the dust in the air, and I didn't know how I was going to let my folks know I was going to be late for supper. And then I remembered, probably from high school civics class or any number of detective movies that I'd seen, that I was entitled to a phone call. Plus, I needed a styrofoam cup or something so I could take my contacts out. So when the next warder came through, he took me back up to the front desk to make my phone call. My mom answered, asked how things were going. Well, I'm in the Oklahoma City jail for selling encyclopedias without a license. There was a pause. Let me get your father. And then I had to ask the desk sergeant which Oklahoma City jail I was locked up in and what the address was because nobody explained anything. Now, what I learned later was that as soon as they hung up with me, my mom and dad called my best friend's dad, who was a judge. And Judge Hutchison speculated that the encyclopedia people probably thought it was cheaper if they got caught to pay the fine rather than buy a license for everybody. And he didn't think this would stay on Steve's record. And don't worry too much about it because he knew the company'd be there later that evening to take care of things. And anyway, give him another call if I didn't show up till morning. Now, as soon as I hung up with my mom and dad, the warder handed me a blanket, and my styrofoam cup. And he led me back to my cell, which roused the guy directly across from me. I don't know, long stringy hair, couple of years older than me, jeans and a plaid shirt, who introduced himself as Montana Man. I had never managed to get a cool nickname like that. Right? Of course, until jail, I hadn't really needed one. Right? But no, we got on. And so we began to talk. He began to tell me his story. The hall lights dimmed for the night. Finally had my contacts out in the styrofoam cup. I draped the blanket over my shoulders as things began to get cool, and then I hung on those bars, forgetting all the guys that had hung on them before me. And Montana began to explain how he was waiting for the LA cops to come and pick him up and transport him back to California because his mom, mind you, had turned him in for selling drugs. So we had a similar problem, selling without a license. No, and even I had heard about how bad the LA cops were, but I had no idea they'd begun to work with moms. And then Montana asked me what I was in for. Selling encyclopedias without a license. And there was laughter from the surrounding darkness. They didn't tell us we needed one, but Montana was sympathetic. Ambushed, man. Ambushed. You know, at least your mom didn't turn you in. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust her again. Talk finally stalled. Things began to settle in for the evening. But it hadn't gone too much further into the evening before one of the warders came back to let me know the company had arrived to set me free. And then driving back to the office in the back of that station wagon, my supervisor sneered, most of his people could take a couple of hours in jail. But as it happened, most of us hopefuls decided to hope for something better, right? No, something that didn't require us to trick people, many of whom looked like our own moms and dads, into answering yes to a bunch of stupid, repetitive questions. And I can't tell you how relieved I was not to have to go back the next morning. But as I was hunched over the paper that next morning, the hair on my neck stood up because I could see their ad waiting in ambush for the next Pearson. But I didn't stop looking for that summer job. I even called my great uncle who ran the Oklahoma City Casket Company. And it turned out that I didn't have the carpentry skills that they needed or the upholstery skills where they did the interior in that silk tuck and roll. But probably less than 2 weeks later, and apparently remembering my recent brush with the law, Judge Hutchison called to ask if I wanted to be his bailiff that summer. Probably safer. No license required. Now, what he really wanted, for any number of reasons that had nothing to do with me, was a long-haired hippie bailiff. Somewhat like he knew me during the school year. He wanted a long-haired hippie bailiff so he could thumb his nose at a couple of those court administrators. He wanted them ambushed, man. Ambushed. Plus, he thought it would be pretty funny Now, what he got was a 19-year-old kid in a suit who had cut his hair because he thought that would make everyone more comfortable, right? And just wanted to be proud of the job that he had landed. And so I called the court to order. I policed the sessions for talking and babies, and then made sure that the witnessing deputies didn't bring their loaded service revolvers into the courtroom. And in between, I did paperwork, answered phones there in the judge's chamber, and then whenever things would settle down, say maybe we had a little extra time before lunch or Friday afternoon finished sooner than we thought, I'd just sit there at my office desk writing poetry. Now, after a while, me and the deputies got to a first-name basis, and after we got comfortable with each other, they began to leave their service revolvers in the bottom drawer of my office desk before they went in to testify, because apparently a pile of loaded service revolvers in an unlocked desk drawer was a lot safer than bringing them into the courtroom, right? Which was against the rules anyway. The problem was that that drawer was the only place I had to keep my lunch. And the heavy service revolvers kept squashing my cheese sandwiches. Now, I didn't like to say anything. I was just trying to fit in. But then one time the judge came in from his chambers while I was sitting there trying to eat a sandwich with the cheese and all the condiments squeezed out around the edges, and there was an imprint of a revolver cylinder in the top of the bread. And he looked at me, turned right back around, went into his chambers, brought back an old, empty, used wooden cigar box, opened it up, took my squashed sandwich, put it in there, and said, "Solved." And as a matter of fact, ever after that, even if I was in court, I could tell when a witnessing deputy arrived because there'd be a solid bass thunk as that revolver hit the wooden cigar box. But like I told you, and then anytime there was any space at all where I wasn't required to do something, I'd sit there at my desk writing poetry, and the deputies would wander in, lean over my shoulder to see what I was doing, kind of smile at each other and nudge them. And I swear to God, turned out their favorite line from my developing opus was the part where I said that I had, quote, elastic misgivings that would stretch to fit around any situation, unquote. Oh, yeah, well, okay, 19-year-old angst. But my judge did felony preliminary hearings, and those deputies had seen a lot. And apparently that line resonated with their work as well. And oh, my brothers and sisters, I learned so many important lessons across those summer jobs. I learned that you could be proud of even the smallest things done well. And I learned that doing the smallest things well over months and months could be really boring. And I learned that sometimes your mom would bail you out, and sometimes she wouldn't. And I learned that deputies could love their poetry and their guns. But most importantly, I learned that your supervisor rarely has your best interest at heart. And my friends and neighbors, I could not have learned those lessons so well or so viscerally from any encyclopedia. Hallelujah.